Okay, here in section 17 on the EAR, we're going to continue on with our discussion on other important EAR definitions. And the first one's a little different from the ones we've seen previously. It's called a deemed export. And as the definition denotes, it is the release of controlled technology or source code to foreign persons in the US. Now, we have subsequent slides on deemed exports, but we want to point out we're not talking about a physical export of a product from the United States or another country for that matter. We're talking about the release of technology or software to a foreign person in the United States. So as we'll see in just a moment, if a foreign person comes to your place of work, your facility, your factory, and controlled technology or source code is shared with or given to them, that's known as a deemed export. More on that in just a moment. A dual-use item. Well, you'll recall from our previous sections that we mentioned one of the main focuses of the EAR was this whole idea of dual-use technology. A technology or a product that could have a commercial application or a military application. So this dual-use item is one that has civilian applications as well as terrorism, military, or weapons of mass destruction, WMD-related applications. Now, as a trade tip, we want to point out that subject to the EAR can mean civilian items, items with both civilian, military, terrorism, or WMD applications, as well as items with military applications that are not on the USML. This is an all-encompassing representation of the meaning of dual-use item, and also helps us to point out that we want to be sure that goods are subject to the EAR and not subject to other government agencies. And finally, goods that may have been moved from the USML to the CCL as part of the Export Control Reform Initiative. Let's go into a little bit more detail on deemed exports. So as you'll see in our first bullet point, a deemed export can take place in different ways. Number one, a visit of a foreign national, a non-US citizen, or a non-green card holder to a facility in the US that houses controlled items being subject to the EAR and appearing on the Commerce Control List. Second sub-bullet point, even the visual inspection of technical data by a foreign national is considered a deemed export. Right below that, the providing of technical assistance to foreign nationals that involves controlled items, also considered a deemed export. Or if we share work with foreign nationals that involves controlled items. So there are different ways that a deemed export can take place. As a trade tip and a catch-all approach to dealing with deemed exports, be guided by the principle that deemed exports occur whenever controlled technology is released to a foreign national in the United States. Now, let's take a look at a real-world scenario that involves deemed exports. So let's run through it. A U.S. fabricator of microchips located in Boise, Idaho, sells a number of products that are found on the CCL, subject to licensing requirements. The company is scheduled to receive a visit from a potential customer in the Czech Republic that is a contract manufacturer for a number of high-tech companies in the U.S. Contract manufacturers make products on behalf of other companies. As part of the visit to the Boise site, the customer in the Czech Republic has requested that they be shown the technical data associated with the design of several of the chips they may wish to purchase. Starting to sound a little bit like a deemed export. All of the visitors coming are foreign nationals, and the chips they want to analyze require a license for export to the Czech Republic. That's important information. Under the EAR, is the Boise company allowed to share this information during the visit? Well, as we'll note in EAR 734.2b2, it states that the release of controlled technology to a foreign national is deemed to be an export. That's where the name comes from. As such, the sharing of the technical data by the Boise company with the foreign nationals from the Czech Republic without first obtaining an export license would be a violation of the EAR. So again, deemed exports aren't about the physical export of products. Let's move on. Some other important EAR definitions. Well, what is an export? We don't want to make assumptions about the definition, the EAR definition of that. Well, an export is an actual shipment or transmission of items subject to the EAR out of the U.S. or release of technology or software subject to the EAR to a foreign national in the U.S. So it can be a physical export, but also a transmission or release of technology or software that is subject to the EAR to a foreign national in the United States. This definition applies sub-bullet point to encryption source code and object code software that is subject to the EAR. EAR 99, super important, and it is a designation for an item that falls under the U.S. Department of Commerce BIS jurisdiction, subject to the EAR, but that does not fit into the parameters of any ECCN. So an item is subject to the EAR, but doesn't appear on the Commerce Control List with an ECCN classification. That falls under this catch-all of EAR 99. We'll be seeing lots more about EAR 99 throughout the balance of this module. As a trade tip, EAR 99 items that are being exported to an embargoed country to an end user of concern or in support of a prohibited end use still may require a license. We'll be seeing more on this subject as well, especially as it relates to what are called the general prohibitions that we'll talk about in just 1 second. So EAR 99 doesn't mean you're off the hook in terms of licensing requirements, a license authorization. It also depends on end user, whether an export is in support of a prohibited end use. These are important factors. More on that in upcoming slides. The general prohibitions that we just mentioned a moment ago, found in Part 736 of the EAR, the prohibitions, of which there are 10, portray conditions or scenarios that prohibit certain exports, re-exports, and other conduct. If any of the general prohibitions apply to a transaction, the exporter must either attain a license or use a valid license exception. We have multiple slides on general prohibitions. They play a critical role in determining compliance with the EAR, so we'll get to them in forthcoming slides. Now, what's a license? We've already said that just because an item is subject to the EAR doesn't automatically mean that it needs a license. It requires an authorization, which could be a license or a license exception. But for purposes of our discussion here, a license is an authorization or the authority issued by BIS that authorizes an export, re-export, or other regulated activity. And this requires a license application and approval. We'll talk more about that later on too. But in terms of a definition, a license exception is an authorization found in Part 740 of the EAR that allows for the export or re-export of items that would otherwise require a license, but only when specific conditions are met. Those conditions are going to differ by the ECCN number, the reasons for control, end use, end user, all the things that we've been talking about. But license exceptions do exist. We'll cover those in great detail as we move forward. No license required. Sounds pretty appealing from an administrative perspective, but upon determination that none of the 10 general prohibitions that we talked about previously, and we'll go into greater detail later on, but upon determination that none of the general prohibitions apply to an item or a transaction, and that all Commerce Control List and country chart requirements are satisfied, an NLR determination is made. No license required. And there are many, many, many instances where items that are subject to the EAR fall under an NLR authorization. We'll see how that works when we go deeper into the topic. Some clarity on other terms that we've been using: a re-export. This is an actual shipment or transmission of items subject to the EAR from one foreign country to another foreign country. So yes, the United States government, BIS, is very interested not just about exports, but re-exports too. A transfer is a shipment, transmission, or release to any persons of items subject to the EAR, either within the U.S. or outside the U.S. So once again, it's not just a geographic U.S. thing. It's goings on outside the U.S. as well. One term that we haven't mentioned yet in too much detail, certainly in this module, but we'll be going through in much greater detail, is the Consolidated Screening List. This is a list of parties for which the U.S. government maintains restrictions on certain exports, re-exports, or transfer of items. This has to do with end users. And remember from our definition going way, way, way back in the Master Export Specialist program that a party can be a person, a company, an organization, a government entity. So that's what we mean by a party. And that certainly applies here for use under the Consolidated Screening List. Some more rather lengthy definitions: principal parties and interest. You might hear this term or may have heard this term used as the USPPI, the U.S. Principal Party and Interest. We'll get to that in just 1 second. But a principal party and interest are those persons in a transaction that receive the primary benefit, monetary or otherwise, of the transaction. It's usually the seller, the exporter from the United States, but not always. As we note in our first sub-bullet point, the U.S. principal party in interest can be the seller, manufacturer, order party, or a foreign entity, but only if that foreign entity is located in the U.S. at the time of purchase. That principal party in interest is responsible for determining licensing authority and obtaining proper license authorization. Whereas principal parties in interest are defined in the EAR, you'll see in our last bullet point that the foreign trade regulations further define the U.S. principal party in interest as well. There's also something known as a foreign principal party in interest, the FPPI. This is the party abroad who purchases the goods for export or to whom final delivery or end use of the goods will be made, and most certainly can be the ultimate consignee. As a sub-bullet point, we should note that the FPPI may choose to accept responsibility for determining licensing authority and obtain proper license authorization. As we saw a moment ago, under the USPPI, the FPPI is a term defined in the Foreign Trade Regulations and also referenced in the EAR. Last slide on other important EAR definitions. Specially designed, and this term will surface a number of times as we move forward. But as part of the Export Control Reform Initiative, that ECR that we've talked about so many times now, the EAR definition of specially designed has been normalized with that of the ITAR. What they're saying there is that the definition that existed previously under EAR and ITAR were not the same. There's still some slight differences in wording, but the alignment of specially designed for both EAR and ITAR purposes quite important, especially as items move from the USML to perhaps the CCL, or certainly subject to the EAR under that Export Control Reform Initiative. In our first bullet point, we'll harken back to some terminology we saw during our ITAR sections. Specially designed, the definition is designed to catch items moving from the USML to CCL. You'll recognize the 600 series as well as the 9X515 discussion that we had. But the focus is, second sub-bullet point, the focus is on if, as a result of development, the commodity or software has properties peculiarly responsible for achieving or exceeding the performance levels, characteristics, or functions in the relevant ECCN. It's all in the name. Has an item, a technology been specially designed? So we want to be able to catch items moving from the USML to the CCL using that aligned specially designed definition. We're going to stop here, and when we continue, we'll move on to steps in complying with the EAR.